She walked into the Navy recruiting office on a humid Tuesday morning in Virginia Beach, her posture so rigid it made the young petty officer behind the desk straighten his own back instinctively. She was neither tall nor particularly imposing at first glance, with short-cropped auburn hair and a face that looked better suited to a classroom than a combat zone. But when she opened her mouth, the entire room seemed to shift. Her name was Winwin Merrick, and she was there to volunteer for a recruiting event, offering to speak to potential candidates about life in the teams. The petty officer, a 22-year-old named Daniels, who had never deployed anywhere more dangerous than Norfolk, blinked at her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Did you say the teams?" She didn't flinch. "SEAL Team 4, actually. Operator. 4 years active before I went into the reserves." Daniels glanced at her civilian clothes. Jeans, a simple polo shirt, nothing that screamed military. But her eyes held something that made him hesitate to call her bluff. He asked for her DD-214, the discharge paper that would prove everything. She told him she didn't have it on her, that she hadn't brought her military records to a volunteer recruitment talk. It was plausible enough. He thanked her for her time, said they'd be in touch, and watched her walk out the door. That should have been the end of it. A strange woman, a strange claim, a strange afternoon. But Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not in the way liars usually felt off, the sweaty palms, the averted eyes, the over-explaining. She had been calm, too calm. And she had used terminology that even he, a sailor who had never seen combat, recognized as authentic. She talked about halo jumps, the way other people talked about taking the bus. She mentioned VBSS operations like they were errands. It was either the most elaborate con he had ever encountered, or she was the real deal. He did what any good petty officer would do. He ran her name through the system. And when the system came back empty, no Winwin Merrick, no service record, no nothing, he picked up the phone and called the one person who handled stolen valor cases with a particular viciousness. Special Agent Morris of the NCIS. Morris was a man who had spent 20 years hunting liars. He had seen men claim to be Delta Force operators when they had never left Missouri. And he had seen women wear medals they bought on eBay to veteran events. But when he started digging into Winwin Merrick, something strange happened. The background check came back clean, too clean. She had a Social Security number, a valid driver's license, an apartment in Norfolk. But there were no school records before the age of 18. No childhood photographs, no family that anyone could locate. It was as if she had materialized out of thin air at the age of 19, fully formed and already enrolled in community college. Morris didn't like things that didn't add up. He liked them even less when they involved stolen valor. So he made a decision that would either make his career or end it. He set up a sting operation at the next recruiting event, where Winwin Merrick was scheduled to speak to a group of high school students considering military service. 3 weeks later, she walked into the high school gymnasium in Chesapeake, Virginia, and found 40 teenagers sitting in folding chairs, waiting to be inspired. She stood at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. She told them about BUD/S training, about the Hell Week where they ran on broken feet and frozen mines. She told them about a night in Ramadi, about the crack of sniper fire and the weight of a teammate bleeding out in her arms. She told them about brotherhood, about sacrifice, about duty. The teenagers listened in rapt silence. The teachers at the back of the room dabbed their eyes. And Special Agent Morris, standing in the shadows near the exit, felt his stomach drop. Because he had heard these stories before. He had interviewed real SEALs, had debriefed real operators, and every word she spoke was textbook accurate. Too accurate. The kind of accurate that only came from either living through something or studying it with the obsessive dedication of a sociopath. When the talk ended, Morris moved. He waited until she stepped outside into the cool autumn air, away from the students, away from the cameras. Then he approached with two uniformed officers and placed a hand on her arm. "Win-Win Merrick, you're under arrest for impersonating a naval officer, a federal offense." She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between exhaustion and relief. As they cuffed her and guided her into the back of the patrol car, she said only one thing: "You're making a mistake." Morris smiled. That's what they all say. The county lockup was a gray concrete box that smelled of bleach and despair. They processed her, took her fingerprints, photographed her face, and placed her in a holding cell with 3 other women who looked at her with the hollow-eyed curiosity of people with nothing left to lose. She sat on the metal bench, back against the wall, eyes closed, and waited. The next morning, she was transported to the federal courthouse in Norfolk for her arraignment. The press had gotten wind of the story by then, a woman claiming to be a Navy SEAL, arrested for stolen valor, and the courtroom was packed with reporters and veterans and curious onlookers. They whispered to each other, craning their necks to get a look at the fraud who had fooled so many. Win-Win Merrick walked into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her, her head held high. She took her place at the defense table, and her court-appointed attorney, a weary-looking man named Harrison, who had defended everything from drug dealers to embezzlers, leaned over to whisper something in her ear. She shook her head slightly, and he sat back, looking confused. The prosecutor, David Chen, was a rising star in the U.S. Attorney's Office. He had a reputation for destroying imposters, for making examples of those who dared to wear the uniform they had never earned. He stood before the judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Williams, and laid out the case with surgical precision. "Your Honor, the defendant has been arrested for falsely claiming to be a Navy SEAL, wearing decorations she did not earn, and potentially defrauding charitable organizations that believe she is a veteran. We have no record of her service, no DD-214, no file in the Defense Enrollment Eligibility Reporting System. She is, by every official measure, a complete and total fraud." The courtroom murmured. Someone in the back yelled, "Shame on you," before being silenced by a bailiff. Win-Win Merrick stared straight ahead, her face betraying nothing. Judge Williams looked down at the defendant, then at the paperwork before her. She was a veteran herself, had served as a JAG officer in the Navy before taking the bench. Stolen valor cases offended her on a personal level. She was prepared to set a high bail, to make an example of this woman, to send a message. But then she looked closer at the photograph attached to the arrest report. It was a booking photo, in harsh fluorescent lighting, no makeup, baggy orange fabric. But pinned to the chest of the jumpsuit, and this made no sense because why would an arrestee be wearing medals, was a silver star. Judge Williams squinted. She adjusted her reading glasses. She leaned forward. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "why is the defendant wearing a silver star in her booking photograph?" Chen blinked. He turned to look at the defendant, then back at his papers. "Your Honor, that must be a mistake. She wasn't wearing any medals when she was booked." "She's wearing one in this photo," the judge said, holding it up. "And I've seen this particular award before, in classified briefings at the Pentagon." The courtroom fell silent. You could hear the ventilation system humming. You could hear someone's cell phone buzzing in a pocket. But you could hear the sharp intake of breath from David Chen, who suddenly looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a trap door. Judge Williams turned to Win-Win Merrick. "Young woman, I'm going to ask you a question, and I expect a truthful answer. Where did you get that silver star?" Win-Win Merrick looked at the judge, and for the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not defiance. Something older, something heavier. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, a door at the back of the courtroom opened quietly, and an old man walked in. He was in civilian clothes, a sports coat, slacks, a tie slightly askew, but the way he carried himself, the way every veteran in the room straightened unconsciously when he passed, told you everything you needed to know. He walked down the center aisle, past the reporters, past the whispering onlookers, and approached the bench. He leaned in and spoke to Judge Williams in a voice so low that only she could hear. "I need a word with the defendant. Alone. Now." Judge Williams looked at him, and her face went pale. She nodded once, sharply, and banged her gavel. "Court is recessed for 1 hour. Bailiff, clear the room. Everyone out." The courtroom erupted in confusion. Reporters shouted questions. Chen protested. Harrison looked like he might faint, but the bailiffs moved efficiently, herding people toward the exits, and within 10 minutes, the room was empty, except for the judge, the old man, and Winwin Merrick, still sitting at the defense table in her orange jumpsuit and her handcuffs. The old man walked over to her, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from her. He studied her face for a long moment, and she studied his. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was grainy, clearly taken in low light, clearly in a combat zone. It showed a team of operators, faces painted, weapons raised, moving through a shattered building. In the center of the photograph, barely visible, was a woman. "Is this you?" the old man asked. Winwin Merrick looked at the photograph. She didn't blink, she didn't flinch. She simply nodded. The old man sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. He was a general, though he wore no uniform. He had been in places most people couldn't imagine, had done things most people wouldn't believe. And he knew, with the certainty of 30 years in special operations, that the woman sitting before him was not a fraud. "And only special forces carry that," he said quietly, pointing to something on her wrist. It was a tattoo, small, almost invisible, a trident with a modification that wasn't standard. "That's a DevGru identifier. Only a handful of people in the world have that tattoo. And every single one of them is either dead or still active in classified operations." Winwin Merrick looked at him, and for the first time her eyes glistened. "Sir, I have not been Winwin Merrick for a very long time, but I was someone else before that, someone whose records were sealed so deep that not even the NCIS can find them." The general leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had heard rumors over the years of women in special operations. Nothing official, nothing confirmed, just whispers in the dark corners of the intelligence community. Rumors of a program so classified that it didn't exist on paper, staffed by women who could go where men could not, who could blend in where operators stood out. "What's your real name?" he asked. She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. That person is dead. She died in a compound outside Mosul, along with 3 of her teammates. Winwin Merrick is who I became when I came back. A quiet life, a simple life, until I couldn't stop myself from talking about the one thing I knew." The general sat in silence for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the bench, and whispered something to Judge Williams. She listened, her face cycling through confusion, shock, and finally, a kind of grim understanding. She nodded, and the general walked out of the courtroom without looking back. When Judge Williams reconvened court, the atmosphere had changed entirely. She looked at David Chen with something like pity. She looked at Winwin Merrick with something like respect. And she spoke in a voice that left no room for argument. "Mr. Chen, you will drop all charges against this defendant immediately. You will expunge her arrest record, and if any of this ever appears in the press, I will hold you personally responsible for a breach of national security." Chen sputtered. "Your Honor, on what grounds?" Judge Williams looked at him over her reading glasses. "On the grounds that you arrested a woman whose service record is classified at a level you cannot access. On the grounds that she has decorations that were awarded in operations that never happened. On the grounds that the United States government owes her an apology, not a prosecution." The courtroom, which had been refilled with confused onlookers, erupted again. But this time, the murmurs were different. This time, people were looking at Winwin Merrick not with scorn, but with something approaching awe. She was released that afternoon. The general was waiting for her on the courthouse steps, leaning against a plain black sedan. He handed her a manila envelope. "Your real records," he said. "Well, as real as they're ever going to get. You're still officially dead, but at least now you have proof if anyone else decides to make trouble." She took the envelope, held it in her hands like it was made of glass. "Thank you, sir." He shook his head. "Don't thank me. Thank that judge. She's the one who recognized the Silver Star. She's the one who called me. If she hadn't, you'd still be sitting in a cell. I'd still be sitting in my office, and none of this would have come to light." Win-Win Merrick, or whatever her real name was, looked at the envelope, then at the sky, then back at the general. "What happens now?" The general shrugged. "Now you go back to your life, or you don't. That's up to you. But I'll tell you one thing. There are people in Washington who are very interested in talking to you. Not about the past, about the future, about the things you know that no one else does." She nodded slowly. She had spent years hiding, years pretending to be someone else, years watching her back and keeping her mouth shut. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to let the world know that women had been in special operations all along, in the shadows, in the silence, like in the places where records don't exist and medals are awarded in secret ceremonies that never happened. She got into the sedan, and the general drove her away from the courthouse, away from the reporters, away from the life she had built as Win-Win Merrick. Where she was going, she didn't know. What she would become, she couldn't say. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a soldier. The story should have ended there. A quiet resolution, a classified file, a grateful nation apologizing in private while maintaining silence in public. But secrets have a way of becoming heavy, and heavy things have a way of sinking to the surface. 3 months after her arrest was expunged, Win-Win Merrick received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. The same grainy image the general had shown her in the courtroom, her team moving through that shattered building in Mosul. But this time, someone had circled one of the figures, not her, but the man next to her. And on the back, in handwriting she recognized with a jolt of cold fear, was a message. "They're still alive, and they're looking for you." She sat in her small apartment in Norfolk, the photograph trembling in her hands, and felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. The team had died that night. All of them. She had watched them fall, had dragged 2 of them behind cover, had called in the medevac that arrived too late. She had the nightmares to prove it, the ones that woke her at 3 a.m. with the taste of dust and blood in her mouth. But if this photograph was real, and she knew it was, knew every detail of it, knew the angle of the light and the position of the bodies, then the handwriting was also real. And the handwriting belonged to a man she had buried with her own hands. She picked up the phone and called the only person she could trust, the general. He arrived at her apartment within the hour, moving with the quiet urgency of a man who understood that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. He looked at the photograph, read the message on the back, and sat down heavily on her second-hand couch. "This changes things," he said. "I know. It means your cover isn't just blown. It means it never existed. If they're alive, if they're looking for you, then everything you've been told about that night is a lie." Win-Win Merrick, her real name was Elena. Though she hadn't used it in years, stood by the window looking out at the gray Virginia sky. She had spent a decade building Win-Win Merrick, brick by careful brick. A community college degree, a quiet job, a life so ordinary that no one would ever look twice. And now, with a single photograph, that life was over. "What do I do?" she asked. The general was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to her side, and looked out at the same gray sky. You find them before they find you, and you find out what really happened that night. She turned to look at him. And if I don't like what I find? He met her eyes. Then you deal with it. The way you always have. One mission at a time. The search took her across the country and back again. She followed whispers and rumors, dead ends and false leads. She talked to people who looked at her with suspicion and people who looked at her with fear. She walked into bars where veterans drank in silence and asked questions that made them look away. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to assemble the truth. The man in the photograph, her teammate, her friend, a man she had held as he died, was alive. He was living under a different name in a small town in Montana, working as a hunting guide, never talking about his past. But he was also watching, waiting. And when Elena finally found him, standing in the doorway of a cabin in the middle of nowhere, she saw in his eyes the same haunted recognition that she felt in her own. "You're supposed to be dead," she said. He smiled, a sad, tired smile. "So are you." They sat at his kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey between them. Gisan talked through the night. He told her about waking up in a field hospital, about being told that the mission had been compromised, about being extracted in the middle of the night and given a new identity. She told him about her own extraction, her own new identity, her own decade of silence. And together, they pieced together what had really happened in Mosul. The mission had been a setup. The intelligence that sent them into that building had been fed to them deliberately by someone who wanted them dead. The other two members of their team, the ones Elena had thought she buried, were also alive, also in hiding, also waiting for the day when they could stop running. "That day is now," Elena said. "We find the others. We find out who set us up, and we make them pay." He looked at her across the table. And for the first time in years, something like hope flickered in his eyes. "I thought I'd never see any of you again. I thought I'd die alone in this cabin, never knowing the truth." She reached across and gripped his hand. "Not anymore. We finished this together, the way we should have finished it 10 years ago." The search expanded. They found the second teammate in Alaska, working on a fishing boat, his hands rough and his eyes wary. They found the third in the deserts of Arizona, living off the grid, surrounded by miles of nothing. And each time, the story was the same. A mission gone wrong, a hasty extraction, a lifetime of silence. 4 ghosts, sitting around a campfire in the Arizona desert, trying to remember who they used to be. The man who had betrayed them was still in the military, still in special operations, but still pulling strings from behind a desk in Washington. He had risen through the ranks, had been decorated for valor, had built a career on the bodies of the men and women he had sacrificed for his own advancement. "We can't touch him," the general said when Elena called him with their findings. "He's too well protected, too connected. If you go after him, you'll be the ones who end up in prison." Elena looked at her teammates around the campfire. She looked at the faces of people who had died and come back, who had lost everything and somehow kept going. And she made a decision. "Then we don't go after him. We go after the truth. We tell our story. We let the world know what happened, and let the world decide." The general was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's a dangerous game, Elena. Once you start telling the truth, you can't stop. And there are people who will do anything to keep you quiet." "I know," she said. "But I've been quiet for 10 years. It's time to make some noise." They started small. A blog, anonymous at first, telling the story of a mission that never happened. Then a podcast, voices disguised, names changed. Then a meeting with a journalist who had a reputation for digging where she shouldn't. And slowly, the truth began to emerge. The man in Washington, his name was Colonel Harris, and he had been their commanding officer in Mosul, watched the story spread with growing alarm. He made calls. He called in favors. He tried to bury the story the way he had buried the team. But the truth, once released, has a way of growing, of spreading, of becoming too big to contain. 6 months after Elena found the first photograph, she sat in a Senate hearing room, flanked by her 3 teammates, and told her story to a committee of men and women who had the power to do something about it. She told them about the mission, about the betrayal, about the decade of silence. She told them about the silver star that had saved her from prison, and the general who had believed her when no one else would. And when she was done, the chairman of the committee, an old veteran himself, with tears in his eyes, leaned forward and said, "Thank you for your service, Commander, and welcome home." Colonel Harris was arrested the next day. The charges were treason, conspiracy, and the murder of the 4 soldiers he had left for dead. He protested his innocence, claimed he was being framed, but the evidence was overwhelming. But the testimony of 4 operators who had died and come back to tell the tale. Elena watched the news coverage from her apartment in Norfolk, a glass of wine in her hand, her teammates scattered across the country, but connected by a bond that death itself could not break. She had spent 10 years as a ghost, hiding from a past that wasn't even real. And now, finally, she was alive again. The phone rang. It was the general. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected. He laughed, a sound she had rarely heard from him. "What now? You going to stay Win-Win Merrick? Or are you ready to be Elena again?" She looked around her apartment. The second-hand furniture, the bare walls, the life she had built out of nothing. It had served its purpose, but it wasn't her. It had never been her. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time to go home. That's wherever that is." The general was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know a place. It's not on any map, but it's full of people like you. People who came back from the dead and aren't sure what to do next." She smiled. "Sounds perfect." She hung up the phone, walked to the window, and looked out at the Virginia sky. It was the same sky she had stared at 1,000 times, but today it looked different, brighter, fuller of possibility. Tomorrow she would pack her bags. Tomorrow she would say goodbye to Win-Win Merrick. But tonight she stood in the gathering darkness and let herself feel something she hadn't felt in a decade. Peace. The ghosts were laid to rest. The truth was out. And Elena, real, alive, finally herself, was ready to start living.